There is a great error in the modern mind which insists that renewal comes through novelty, new experiences, new philosophies, new escapes. But renewal of the mind, the kind that endures and transforms, does not begin with novelty. It begins with truth, not new truth, but ancient truth rediscovered and rightly ordered within the soul. The mind is not an empty vessel to be filled with whatever comes down the current of the age. It is more like a mirror, smudged and dimmed by years of vanity and distraction. To renew it is to polish it until it reflects the divine image once again. But how does one begin this great renewal? It begins with the imagination, not the wild, unchecked fantasy that seeks to unmake reality, but the sanctified imagination that awakens wonder in what is real. It is the imagination that helps us see the invisible, that allows the moral law to become more than a rule and instead a vision of the good. A renewed mind first imagines rightly, for what the soul admires, the will soon desires. Yet imagination is not enough. It must be tethered to reason, not the cold, mechanical reason that seeks only efficiency or control, but the reason that seeks meaning and coherence. The world is not nonsense, and the mind is not designed to live on contradictions. To reason well is to think in harmony with the logos, the ordering principle of all creation. The renewing of the mind demands that we unlearn much of what the world has taught us, that comfort is king, that pleasure is truth, and that truth is optional. The renewed mind is also one that has learned to discern. Not everything that glitters is gold, and not every sentiment is virtuous. One must learn to distinguish between what is merely desirable and what is truly good. And this discernment is not instinctive, it is formed. Like the taste for music or poetry, it is cultivated through discipline and repetition. The mind that is being renewed is a mind that submits itself to the good and refuses to make peace with what is false, however fashionable. But the greatest secret is this: the mind cannot renew itself. The effort to change one's thinking by willpower alone is like trying to lift oneself by the collar. At best, it rearranges the furniture in the same crumbling house. True renewal comes from without, from a source higher than reason, deeper than emotion, and stronger than will. The mind is renewed when it is surrendered, when it is offered up as a living sacrifice, no longer conforming to the pattern of the age, but being transformed by truth that is eternal and unchanging. And make no mistake, this is not a one-time awakening. It is a continual turning, a daily defiance of the world's corrosive suggestions. The modern world is full of noise, and the mind left unattended will absorb its messages, that you are the center, that your desires define you, that nothing is sacred and everything is negotiable. But in quiet reflection, in humble submission to the eternal, the mind is washed and the soul restored. The renewed mind does not look different on the outside. It walks in the same streets, reads the same news, faces the same tragedies. But it sees differently. It is not swayed by fear, not deceived by flattery, not enslaved by appetite. It has learned to think with eternity in view. It chooses love when hate is easier, truth when lies are popular, and hope when despair is fashionable. This is not the work of a moment, but the journey of a lifetime, and yet the first step may be taken today, by admitting that we are not well, that our thoughts are not always true, that we have, in fact, been conformed far more than we realize. And then, by seeking, earnestly, humbly, the truth that renews. True renewal begins by reordering the imagination and aligning it with eternal truth. True renewal begins by reordering the imagination and aligning it with eternal truth. The imagination is often misunderstood as a mere playground for fantasy or fiction, but it is, in fact, one of the most powerful faculties of the human mind. It is through the imagination that we begin to conceive of things beyond our immediate experience. The imagination does not operate in opposition to reason. Rather, it extends reason's reach by giving form and substance to abstract ideas. When rightly ordered, imagination allows us to see virtue, justice, love, and holiness not as distant concepts, but as vivid realities. It is the beginning of moral awakening, because we cannot desire what we cannot envision. Imagination sets the soul in motion toward the good, but only when it is aligned with truth that does not change with the times. The disordering of imagination is one of the most effective tools the modern world uses to capture the mind. It does not primarily argue against virtue, it distracts from it. It floods the imagination with images of false glory, distorted love, hollow ambition, and counterfeit freedom. If the soul sees these long enough, it begins to admire them, and what the soul admires, the will eventually pursues. Therefore, renewing the mind must begin not with external behavior, but with the internal landscape of the imagination. It is not enough to tell people what is true. They must be helped to see that it is beautiful. Beauty is the lure that draws the heart toward truth, and imagination is the lens through which beauty is perceived. This reordering requires not only intention but discipline. The imagination, like a garden, must be cultivated. We must be careful about what we feed it, what we allow to grow within it, and what we uproot from its soil. Much of what passes for entertainment is in fact a slow erosion of the soul's capacity to imagine the good. When we constantly consume images of selfishness, vengeance, lust, and vanity, we should not be surprised when our minds become dull to holiness. The discipline of reordering the imagination includes surrounding oneself with stories, art, music, and literature that elevate rather than degrade. It means spending time in reflection rather than stimulation, contemplation rather than consumption. The imagination must also be set free from the tyranny of immediacy. In a world that prizes the instant, the imagination helps us dwell on what is eternal. It teaches the mind to look up, to long for what is above, and to hope beyond the present moment. A renewed imagination sees through the temporary illusions of power and possession, and fixes its gaze on the deeper realities that outlast time. This is not escapism, it is resistance. It is the resistance of a soul that refuses to be confined by the narrow boundaries of the visible and insists on the possibility of transcendence. When the imagination is reordered, it reorients the entire being. It changes how we interpret suffering, how we perceive others, and how we understand our own purpose. We begin to recognize patterns of redemption where before we saw only randomness. We start to desire what is good even when it is hard, and to resist what is evil even when it is easy. This shift is not the result of willpower but of vision. People change most profoundly when they see differently, when the story they live within is transformed. A reordered imagination gives us a new story, one in which we are not the center, but participants in a grander design. This design is ancient, yet ever new. It tells of a reality where truth and grace are not in conflict, where love is not weakness, and where sacrifice leads not to loss but to life. Through this lens, the mind begins its journey of renewal, not by effort alone, but by illumination. Reason and discernment are essential tools for resisting cultural conformity. Reason and discernment are essential tools for resisting cultural conformity. In a world where popular opinion shifts like sand, and where truth is often reduced to feeling, the mind is easily swayed without a stable foundation. Reason is the gift that allows humans to think beyond impulse, to question assumptions, and to test the validity of ideas before embracing them. But reason alone is not enough. It must be paired with discernment, the ability to distinguish not only between truth and falsehood, but between what is good and what merely appears to be good. Discernment is the fine-tuned instrument that detects the counterfeit in a world full of distractions and imitations. Modern society encourages conformity by presenting its values as self evident, its priorities as urgent, and its pleasures as necessary. Through repetition and emotional appeal, the culture persuades rather than proves. It appeals to instinct rather than intellect. Without the discipline of reason, the individual becomes vulnerable to manipulation, believing whatever is easiest, most comforting, or most loudly proclaimed. Reason calls us to examine ideas, to trace their consequences, and to test whether they align with a greater moral order. It does not settle for the immediate or the popular. It insists on coherence, on meaning, on truth that holds under scrutiny. Discernment, meanwhile, is what allows the soul to navigate between subtle choices. It recognizes that not all that is permissible is beneficial, and not all that is accepted is virtuous. It is a kind of spiritual vision that perceives the difference between the shadows and the substance. While reason may expose the flaws in an argument, discernment sees the spirit behind the message. It is what prevents the mind from being led astray by messages that are technically sound but morally hollow. Discernment is cultivated through reflection, experience, prayer, and above all, humility. A proud mind is easily deceived because it trusts in its own brilliance. A humble mind is teachable and thus able to grow in true wisdom. Cultural conformity thrives when people stop asking hard questions. It flourishes when people prefer comfort over conviction and when they accept slogans in place of thought. Reason and discernment are the defense against this subtle surrender. They require the courage to stand apart, to risk being misunderstood, to reject ideas that are celebrated, and to affirm truths that are ridiculed. This is not an act of rebellion for its own sake, but a higher allegiance to truth itself. The mind that is being renewed must learn to stand, not because it enjoys conflict, but because it cannot be bought by flattery or silenced by fear. The process of resisting conformity is not only about what one rejects, but what one embraces. Reason and discernment do not lead to cynicism or endless skepticism. They point toward a greater clarity, a sharper vision of the good, the beautiful, and the true. They reveal the internal contradictions of a culture that praises freedom but punishes dissent, that champions tolerance but refuses truth, that elevates the self but devalues the soul. The mind that is anchored in reason sees through these inconsistencies, not with bitterness but with compassion. Discernment enables the soul to offer something better than what the world presents, a life built not on passing trends but on unshakable foundations. These faculties must be trained. They do not develop in a vacuum or flourish in laziness. They are strengthened by study, by dialogue, by careful reading, and by honest examination of one's own assumptions. The mind must be exposed to ideas that challenge it, not to destroy it, but to refine it. It must learn to love truth more than comfort, and to seek wisdom more than applause. This is the soil in which a renewed mind grows. It is not swept along by the tide of opinion, nor hardened by pride, but rooted in reality and guided by light that does not flicker. The mind cannot renew itself. It must be transformed through daily surrender to divine truth. The mind cannot renew itself. It must be transformed through daily surrender to divine truth. The modern spirit often preaches autonomy as the highest ideal, encouraging individuals to look inward for all answers, to generate their own meaning, to shape reality according to their own desires. Yet this inward turning is precisely what traps the mind in its own confusion. A mind wrapped in self cannot see beyond the limitations of its own thoughts, fears, and habits. Renewal, therefore, cannot begin with the self, but must come from a source higher and more stable than the self. The mind must be lifted out of its narrowness, and this can only happen when it is willingly submitted to something greater. Surrender is not weakness. It is the necessary act of one who recognizes that clarity, purpose and peace do not come by exerting more mental effort, but by opening the soul to receive. Daily surrender is not a dramatic act done once and for all. It is quiet, habitual, and deeply personal. It is choosing each day to orient the mind toward truth rather than noise, toward light rather than illusion, toward order rather than chaos. The world is filled with messages that promise self-fulfillment but deliver distraction, promises of enlightenment that offer only shallow stimulation. Without a conscious surrender to something eternal, the mind becomes reactive, restless, and shaped by every passing influence. Divine truth is not something the mind can create or improve upon. It is not subject to cultural negotiation or personal convenience. It is revealed, and because it is revealed, it must be received. The posture of receiving requires humility, a recognition that no matter how intelligent or informed a person may be, their own understanding is incomplete. Truth, when it comes from the divine, is not merely information, it is illumination. It not only teaches the mind but reorients the heart. The mind cannot reshape itself with borrowed parts from the latest philosophy or spiritual trend. It must be made new by something that existed before it, something that calls it higher, something that is not shifting but eternal. This transformation happens gradually through daily exposure to the right source. A renewed mind is not formed by sudden inspiration alone, but by steady immersion in what is true, just as a healthy body is maintained by consistent nourishment and rest. The mind is renewed through consistent dwelling in the presence of truth. This may include silence, reading, meditation, worship, and reflection, habits that open the windows of the soul to let in the light. Over time, these practices begin to displace anxiety with peace, confusion with clarity, and pride with wisdom. It is not a self-improvement project, but a relinquishing of control to the one who designed the mind in the first place. The transformation of the mind is not merely intellectual. It touches the will, the emotions, the affections. A renewed mind does not only think differently, it feels differently, desires differently, chooses differently. It is less reactive, more patient, less scattered, more anchored. The old patterns of thought self, pity, bitterness, arrogance, fear are slowly replaced with new patterns of gratitude, hope, humility, and love. This is not because the person has learned better coping strategies, but because their mind has been recentered on truth that does not bend to mood or moment. The old self shrinks, not through force, but through focus on something greater. Daily surrender is not a passive resignation, but an active allegiance. It is saying no to the tyranny of self and yes to the freedom of truth. It is the continual decision to trust that divine wisdom is not only higher but better, that what is revealed is not only true but good. The result of this surrender is not diminished intellect but heightened awareness, not dulled personality but awakened identity. The mind becomes what it beholds, and when it beholds truth daily, it becomes clear, strong, and alive.